you were saying?
Why would SAVA tell a foreign government, let alone one whose support was deemed, I assume, to be critical in various fields, that, my God, gentlemen, we have a terrible problem here, our government may not survive, or we have a significant and active, violent dissident movement in this country. So if you depended on SAVA for a realistic picture of Iran, where would you be? Okay. If you depended on the Inspector General of the Pentagon to conduct an investigation of illegal bribery in contracts, I don't think you'd get very far. All right? So you have a biased witness for the announcement. So it may be that Washington thought it was dependent on SAVAK, but that would be simply because they refused to accept other information to the contrary. After all, if the ambassador is getting up repeatedly and giving his island of tranquility in a sea of trouble speech, which all ambassadors did ad nauseum while I was there, how then could you accept information that said, this is not an island of tranquility, this is part of the sea of troubles? It's a bit like the expert anthropologist or archaeologist who writes his life work on the fact that Folsom Points are 9,000 years old, only to find one at 30,000 BC and have his book destroyed. He'd fight to the last moment before he said, geez, I was wrong. Tear up my life work and throw it away. It's not quite a fair analogy, but all analogies are flawed, and that is too. The problem is that we seem politically committed to the Shah's government as impeccable. At least we told the Time Life group when they traveled. We said it in speeches in Washington and dinners and so on, and granted hyperbole for public consumption. The fact remains that the U.S. government did not want to look at an Iran that had significant dissidence, let alone at the reasons why there was dissidence, because I believe, going back to what we were saying earlier, if they believed that, they would have had to take some action.
So Time Life traveled to Iran, and you gave briefings to them, to their writers? Or
I think that was in 1970, the whole time, you know, the business leader.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that, it was an endless series of speeches to whomever.
Was that the investor conference? The Rapid Time magazine?
I recall, it could have been, I don't recall the details of it, but I think it was simply that normal periodic Time Life travel. Could have been an investors group. There was an investors group that came.
That Rockefeller organized.
But the particular day that I remember, I don't remember what the group was. I thought it was just simply that Time Life executive group. Could have been the investors group. Did you read Zinken's book on the origin of the prominent families in Iran? Described the 400 families of great power and historical.
The book by who?
Zinken, I think. Isn't it? That's in Chicago.
Oh, Zionist?
Marvin Zonas. Sorry, not Zinken. Zinken wrote on India.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Marvin Zonas. That's an excellent book. And I suspect, like the post-cultural revolution in China, the time will come when the persistence of culture and the persistence of family names and the persistence of Persian culture will put most, if not all, of those families back to where they were. We have a very short perspective, the Americans.
Now, when you gathered information on the opposition and prepared reports, did any of this go to the embassy, to Meyer, or the embassy as such?
Oh, everything that we wrote did. Well, not everything, but almost everything. Everything that was not that certainly all the reports go to everyone in the embassy who has access to them, and to various places in Washington. Sure.
And some alluded to the State Department as well.
Of course. Yeah. Of course. Standard. Why else? I mean, intelligence goes to people who need it, and God knows state is the major consumer.
How did Ambassador Meyer read these reports? How did he respond to them? Since you seem to have a strong view of the role of the opposition, did he appreciate hearing this news, or?
I don't really know what Armin Meyer's reaction was. I know Douglas MacArthur Jr., or second, I guess it was, didn't want any part of them, and was quite unhappy that they were constantly cluttering up the mail.
When I interviewed Richard Arndt a while ago, he mentioned an incident involving an unnamed agency officer, in which this officer prepared a report based upon contacts with various Iranian nationals. Apparently the nationals gave him information that suggested the breadth and extent, the breadth and depth of the opposition to the Shah. And from what Arndt told me, this report alarmed Ambassador Meyer to a great extent. And in fact, Arndt had to go in and vouch for the report's accuracy. Do you recall any, I'm not sure if it was you who wrote the report or somebody else, but do you recall any report in particular that would have raised that kind of reaction by Ambassador Meyer?
I know of several reports that produced that kind of reaction with different ambassadors during my time there. Again, we go back to the business of the anthropologist having written his life work only to find it was untrue because of information that came up later. If a report on the extent, breadth, depth, intensity, volume, etc. of opposition, if it adds up to a problem, quote, problem, end quote, falls in a political context where the ambassador has been assuring Washington, if it's mentioned at all, that there is no significant opposition. Or again, back to this question, if the report is so persuasive and so detailed and so concrete, i.e. credible, then the next problem is, now what do we do? If I accept this report as genuine and credible and real, if this describes reality, we have to do something. All right, that's a hell of a burden. So you have two problems. One, an ambassador who has been saying that things are fine, and two, if things aren't fine, what do we do about it? And so you have two problems, and that happened repeatedly in terms of the descriptions of the nature and depth of political opposition. I think we were weak in terms of relationships and understanding of the opposition. I don't think, at least in my time, we did a good job of providing credible information on the depth, breadth, and extent of the opposition. But on the other hand, there were very few resources devoted to that, and of course some limitations on what individuals who were going to be targeted. Again, it's a congenital problem. Iran is one of many countries where I'm sure that's the case. In the time that, just an analogy, in the early 60s when I was in Kabul, the agency was crying wolf, wolf about the number of Afghan young men who were being sent to the Soviet Union for military training, about the extent of Soviet influence through their various military, commercial, economic projects, about the presence of the KGB there and what they were doing, and the GRU. That meant you had to do something about it, so to speak, if you accepted that thesis. There wasn't a whole lot we could do, and after Henry Byrode left Kabul, there weren't very many people who were interested in being told that the implications of present trends in Afghanistan are devastating for us. And of course they were.
Now back to the question of religious opposition. I've read in James Bill's new book that at one time or the other, one of the agency's contacts, Iranian contacts, provided considerable information on the Shiite religious establishment. Was this information being accumulated when you were in Tehran?
Some of it.
And Bill also says that there was a file that accumulated reports on the establishment. But this file had not been forwarded to Langley at all. It was not until later on that some analyst at Langley was in Tehran, found the file and brought it back with them. Does this ring a bell? Was this?
No, that doesn't ring a bell. Of course, the U.S. government had files on the Shia clergy. They had files on Arabistan, they had files on Khorasan, they had files on workers, they had files on demographics, they had files on all the ways you slice a country. Whether or not this was a file other than a catch-all for notes or fragments of conversations or excerpts from contact reports or otherwise, I don't recall. Of course we had a file on the Shia clergy. This was the major opposition. Remember that in Iran, or almost, and I'm sure you could take this template and change the names and lay it on any country, what organizations, what institutions have nationwide scope in terms of a support structure, apparatus for a political opposition? Well, the government does. If nothing else, tax collectors, gendarmerie, military. Okay? SAVAK did as a separate kind of entity, a political intelligence entity. The mullahs did in every village, okay? And the bazari, the merchants did in every town. Okay, so those were in place national structures, institutions, who had legitimate reasons for being in touch. Constantly, day to day. Mullahs to mullahs, merchants to merchants, SAVAK to SAVAK, army to army, tax collectors to tax collectors. Here are spider webs that cover a whole country, and where the people within them have reasonable and legitimate access to every other member of their group. I don't mean that they're restricted to contacts within their group. Those groups had grounds for constant communications, travel, exchange of money, exchange of ideas, and anything else they wish to exchange. Goat peddlers have the same kind of rat lines, so to speak. But in Iran, the mullahs had a terribly well-organized structure and were avowed critics of the government. The bazari, the merchants, had a complete nationwide institution which permitted all kinds of interchange of ideas and information and attitudes. Both of those were opposed to the government, the bazari for different reasons. And yes, Khomeini should be worried about the bazari because his government has basically taken from the bazari what they have always wanted, and that is wealth. But at that time, the bazari were very much in support of the dissident Shia clergy. Right? So of course you keep files on groups like this.
Did you know any of the clergy yourself, personally?
Yes, I knew some.
What kind of information, what kind of ideas and attitudes did they have? Were they some of the opposition people, or were they more neutral?
They were opposed to the government, and they opposed it on theological grounds. If you recall the mantle of the prophet, these people, however scruffy they tend to appear in pictures in the New York Times or addressing crowds, are very intelligent. Well, not all of them are very intelligent. The leadership of the Shia clergy tend to be extraordinary people. They're courageous people. They have the courage of their convictions, both intellectual and religious. They have relatively excellent educations. They have an intense interest in their religion and its success at both theologic and day-to-day levels. They are a formidable group. And God help us for calling them dumb mullahs, as we often tend to call people we don't like. Too bad, because they are a very, very interesting group of people. In my view, measurably more interesting than the coterie around the show.
Can you give me some of the names of the contacts among the clergy that you developed when you were in Iran?
No, I think that would be a grave error. I certainly wouldn't want to do that.
Okay. Now, in general, how much interest did Langley have in getting this kind of information on the opposition, on the clergy, the bazari, and elsewhere?
Well, less so than our geopolitical concerns about things like the Soviets. Basically, we saw the Iranian structure as dependable and stable within limits. And U.S. policy, the agency is not this rogue elephant. People, I don't know about Casey's agency. I left in the middle of his tenure, but the agency provides intelligence in response to the requests given us by other elements of the government. And the other elements of the government were not really very interested in the opposition, for a lot of the reasons we've talked about, and also because the opposition was not imminently on the verge of overthrowing the Shah's government. It wasn't until 8 years after I left that they did so. And one must remember that U.S. intelligence resources, that is, the number of people devoted to the collection of intelligence on any subject, is quite limited in any country. So this turns out to produce a situation where intelligence on the opposition in Iran was, as we said earlier, of distinctly secondary importance. It is the responsibility of CIA, wherever it may be in touch with the subject of opposition to any government. Opposition to the Soviet government. Opposition to the government of Mexico. Opposition to Mulroney's government in Canada. I don't know what we do in Canada. Maybe we don't have any. But anyway, the point is, of course, if they don't do it, who is? So yes, we have a brief to cover the opposition, quote unquote opposition, whatever it is and wherever it is, even if the report says there isn't any.
Did you get requests from time to time for information along that line? Or was it just
Yes.
provided on your own accord?
Primarily from the analysis side of the agency.
There
There were 2-3 people who had been following Iran from those halcyon days of the 50s all the way through, and who were very knowledgeable, much more knowledgeable in depth than I was, who could rattle off genealogies and relationships, who, for example, were intimately acquainted with the structure of the Mossadegh government and who was who and who was related to whom and so forth. And they followed it out of both professional responsibility and personal interest. I think that's a fair way to characterize it. CIA has a professional responsibility to maintain touch with the subject. What is the opposition? What does this amount to, and what are the implications of it?
James Bill, in his new book, he mentions the names. He says Charles Rudolph, I think, and Ernest Olney, and Charles Rudolph, I think. Was it Charles or?
I don't know if Charles.
He has Charles Rudolph as another Iran specialist of the agency. Did these people come to visit the station from time to time? Did they come?
Yes, CIA analysts do come abroad periodically. The difference between two-dimensional paper and the smell of the bazaar is quite important. The feel of a country is different from in writing than it is in fact, obviously.
Now you mentioned that you passed on your reports pretty routinely to the embassy.
Well, pretty routinely. I mean, that's what we do.
Yeah, routinely.
We collect them, we write them, and we disseminate them.
Okay. In general, how much cooperation was there between the political officers and the embassy and then the CIA officers?
Well, that often turned out to be a matter of personal predilection. Some of my very dearest friends, people for whom I have tremendous respect, were embassy officers as such. And while their brief may or may not include opposition, it's everybody's brief. It's everybody's brief to cover the issues of importance in the country. And certainly the state had its own responsibilities in that respect, and many of the political officers were close personal friends. Some were not. Some thought the agency really ought to be consigned to, I don't know, one of Dante's lower regions, but that's another problem. I certainly understood why they felt that way. On the other hand, it's too bad.
To what extent did the situation, did the political situation in Iran change while you were there in the late 60s into the early 70s?
Well, this was the eve of the assassination of Americans. This was the threshold of organized, substantive violence. SAVAK was out in gun battles on the streets with people who had taken up arms. It was a sad time in a way because the Shah, again, context. There were probably as many, I don't know whether this is accurate, but my impression is there were probably as many universities and as many university students in Iran, let alone abroad, as there were in most of the rest of the Middle East put together. The health corps, the education corps, the building of roads and dams and infrastructure, many of the things that the Shah sought to bring about cannot be viewed in any other terms but laudable goals for the people who needed a lot of help. I think the Shah did many magnificent things in Iran. I would that his peers in other countries had done nearly as much. But the problem remained that on both religious and economic grounds there were some very significant problems developing, and the mullahs and the Marxist mullahs, they called themselves by terms the martyrs, the left-wing martyrs, Mujahideen cult. Became quite violent. They organized assassinations. They organized dissemination of propaganda. They took Khomeini's tapes and distributed them. They obviously were meeting consistently and regularly in a clandestine fashion and developing the infrastructure that led ultimately to the overthrow of the Shah. They tried to work the military and with some success in all the branches of service. They certainly were working universities, although they tend to look down their nose at the intellectuals, the national fronters, because they were committed to many of the nice things in their lives that they had: jobs, money, cars, Savile Row suits, etc. Though, if you remember the first government that came in after the Shah left, it was composed significantly of national fronters. Okay? It didn't last long, but those were the names and the people to whom the mullahs turned initially anyway. And in their arrogance or egoism or lack of touch with the vital thrust of the mullahs' rebellion, they were really out of it and didn't last very long. They did not have the intensity, nor did they have the goals. The National Front was basically a secularly oriented group. The Mossadegh view of the country was a view which was basically secular. And that wasn't all that different from the Shah's view. It would squabble over what kind of representation you'd have, what role Parliament would play, would it have power or no power, who would make the laws, and who would share the power, the spoils of political power. So they didn't last very long, but they too existed, talked, attempted to organize. Whether or not SAVAK knew, quote unquote, their every move, that's not feasible, not likely. But certainly SAVAK was aware that national fronters met and kept a wary eye on them. They were not, and then again, National Front was playing politics in a Western sense, in a secular sense. The mullahs were much more serious about their views. The level of intensity, their willingness to commit themselves body and soul, and I mean that body and soul, was so much greater than that of the National Front.
Some historians have suggested that around this time, around 1970 or so, that the degree of internal repression increased. I guess it's more or less parallels that you're saying about the rise of the real opposition during this period.
Well, certainly SAVAK when you engage in running gun battles on the streets, okay, then Sadat gets pretty concerned, because you can't tell the Shah that we had a running gun battle with 3 people we believe to be mujahideen, one of whom took a poison pill and killed himself after he was shot. You can't tell him that, and at the same time tell him, but it's okay. We're not going to change our MO, we're not going to take any more precautions. Indeed, they got very serious about the problem. They had to. They were losing generals and police chiefs and government representatives and some foreigners. So yes, they stepped up their activities. Indeed, they did.
How much traveling around the country did you, to change the subject, how much traveling around the country did you do when you were in Toronto?
Not nearly as much as I wanted to. I would like to have done a great deal more than I did. I would guess once a month I was out somewhere, whether it was nearby or far by. I didn't travel the country the way I had in other countries for a variety of reasons. I had some responsibilities that kept me there. And just didn't get out nearly as much as I would have liked to. But I'd say once a month I was off somewhere.
Okay. When did you leave Tehran?
When was it? Perhaps May of 71, June of 71.
Around the time you left, what was your impression of the... you discussed it some ways before, but what was your impression of the political, or your reading of the political stability of the Shah's, of the stability of the Shah's position?
The Shah, by the very thick history, was in charge of the country. It was slipping out from under his structure. The efforts that were devoted to the celebration of the founding of the Persian Empire had sarcastic critics who said, you know, we need this for schools and roads and dams and not for this ego display. On the other hand, the same people would say, well, we do have a great cultural history, and it isn't a bad thing to call that to the attention of the world. But they criticized it on the grounds that this was an ego trip by the Shah. That really is too bad, because I think Iranian culture deserves all the attention it can get. Probably the finest poetic tradition in the history of mankind, as far as I'm concerned. Certainly a history of accomplishment in government. If you're talking about Cyrus, you know, Herodotus has a marvelous passage where Cyrus is talking with Croesus, whose country he's just overcome. It's a marvelous passage, but it does reflect an essentially benign and quite generous perspective on what conquest means, what the implications are for government. But, yeah, the Shah was in charge of the government. One wonders if he knew what was happening around him or whether he chose to ignore it. It is not unimportant that when push came to shove, he left rather than turn the army loose on his population. Whatever else one might say of him, that is a fact that one should at least seek an understanding of. What did that mean by way of his attitude toward Iran? I think he was so tied up and intensely focused on the economic development of Iran, his vision of Iran's place in the world, which is a mix of culture and history and poetry and predilection and appetite and all kinds of other things, that he may very well have downplayed, or maybe just basically not understood why anyone would oppose what he is trying to accomplish. I think it's very difficult to fault him in terms of his vision of the country and what he was seeking to do to bring that about. I think you certainly can fault him on misreading the intensity and the depth of opposition and the reasons for it, the vulnerabilities of his government, including corruption, including the bowling alley and all that went with the idle rich and the jet set. There was a bowling alley on one of the major streets in Iran, and the hangers on it. And I mean, again, if you read The Mantle of the Prophet, if you see the feel the religious bitterness at a bowling alley with girls in lipstick and drinking alcohol and dancing and loud music. There was a club called La Bohème nightclub where they had probably the biggest speakers outside of a baseball park where they used to play rock or loud music anyway. And the jet set went there. There were some filthy rich Iranians. And they were a pretty disreputable group. And I don't think he understood the level of antipathy that generated in poor people that surrounded the club, that worked at the club. So, and when you add to that a religious dimension, you have the ingredients for a religious revival and an overthrow. This is such a vulnerable target. This made his government so vulnerable to criticism and engendered such intensity in opposition to it.
This brings up another question of mine, which you discussed this to some extent earlier, but did the agency collect information on the Shah and his family and the coterie around him? Was that information accumulated and passed on?
Incidentally,
yeah.
Certainly in terms of power, certainly in terms of who struck John, to a certain extent the issue of corruption. But again, there were not a great many resources devoted to that. It's almost like, again, analogies are weak, but that marvelous phrase, everybody knows. Everybody knows that there has been significant corruption in the letting of U.S. government military contract since Eisenhower. That doesn't mean it didn't go on before that, but he certainly felt concerned about it from a somewhat different perspective. But everybody in Washington knows this. Every newspaper correspondent, every congressman, every staff aide knows that, I mean, quote, unquote, everybody knows, there is corruption in the letting of contract. Now we have it on the front page, and something is being legally done about it. Everybody knew there was corruption in Iran. Everybody in the U.S. mission, whoever was there for more than 5 minutes, and anybody who paid any attention to Iran at all knew that there was corruption in the government of Iran, knew how you got a contract, knew who you had to bribe to see the minister, how much, and what percentage of the contract. All the European competitors for the U.S. in terms of arms supply and infrastructure and so on factored that into their bids. I talked to a number of foreign businessmen who were there. Oh yes, this is the percent you have to pay on this kind of a contract, this is who you have to pay, so forth and so on. So everybody knew that. Yes, the embassy wrote 2 messages that I recall, and maybe others, which quite carefully delineated that. Excellent report. But so what? The Persian Empire has been doing that since before Cyrus, and so have the Syrians and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and everybody else. To say that it's a way of life and a way of doing business, and thereby tacitly accepting it, is not at the same time to say it's a good thing, or good for the country, or morally acceptable, or ethically delightful. But it certainly was a fact, and it was a fact that everybody knew. Most particularly those who were dealing with the Iranian government on contracts, U.S. and foreign, and Iranian. I'll tell you a story. One of my religious friends who had wrapped his deep bitterness with the government and the lack of power which the religious structure had, lack of influence, power really, not influence, said, well, look, Price, at least in this government, if you need a driver's license or a business license or a piece of equipment imported, you know who to go to, and you know how much to pay, and you know how long it will take. He said that is an improvement over what it used to be, because you didn't know who to go to, and you never got your part. Now you can go to someone, pay him his accustomed bribe, and get what you need. And he said that with great bitterness, but he said it very seriously, very sincerely. This is how the government works. But this is how the government always worked. Maybe this is how the Pentagon works. And I don't mean as broadly and congenitally as in Iran. But I lived some 17, 18 years in the Middle East. I don't know a government ministry in any of the countries I served in that was not up to its ears in, whether you call it bakshish or whatever you call it. This is the way the system works. And the reason for that is that a civil servant gets nothing by way of salary. And it is therefore an accepted custom within those cultures that his salary is to be increased by whatever he can get by way of bribes. Therefore, the government payroll is considerably lower than it otherwise would be.
So you did studies on this question of economic corruption, or?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
What I'm saying is it's one of these everybody knows things.
Yes.
Okay? It wasn't news. Any more than it's news, except to the naive, that there are bribes in the letting of Pentagon military contracts. Not all contracts, but many. Okay?
Did you do much work on economic conditions, or?
I didn't do much work. I was a political officer there, but I was very, very seriously interested in the economic structure of the country. It was similar to, although the oil revenues were extraordinarily high, and although the Shah's expenditures on arms and modern military equipment were extraordinarily high, fact remains there's a lot of other money sloshing around that economy. And there were all kinds of demographic and political implications to the economic developments that were taking place. This great copper lode that lies in east central Iran, that had never gotten off the ground. In fact, I don't really, and I've lost track of that. That could have been a source of considerable balance to the fluctuating oil prices, which were going up at the time I left, but which inevitably were going to go into an up and down business. The implications of the reforestation effort, which was begun by the Shah, were interesting. It never was carried out. It may never be carried out, but there was a time when things were quite a bit different in terms of forestation. There were a lot of very interesting economic implications. Perhaps the most immediate and gravest problem was this migration from the countryside to Tehran. No one can cope with that. We can't even cope with it here. Look at Los Angeles. You know, the Crips and the Bloods and all are in part a reflection of tremendous population movement. Tremendous. We're not talking about the Middle Ages, but if we lived in a period of disequilibria, economic disequilibria, which it seems always to exist, we would have mass movements of people. And California, perhaps, not to be too parochial, is a perfect example of that. If there were no border and if there were no INS, how many Mexicans would presently live in California? Cinco de Mayo is a major holiday here, and will be increasingly so. We can drive 5 minutes from here over to the Mission District, where now at least half, if not more than half, of the signs are in Spanish. So, anyway, it's this kind of extra government migration that constituted a major problem, first economic and second political.
Did the station have an economics officer who worked on economic changes or looked at?
Not as such.
Yeah. What about the oil question, petroleum developments?
Well, petroleum developments were handled by a petroleum officer in the embassy, who was a very knowledgeable person and very thoughtful. Did an excellent job of covering the whole.
John Washington, I think.
Mm-hmm. And very graceful, very gregarious, easy, but very sharp officer. I thought he probably the quality that petroleum reporting out of the embassy was the best they did, in my view. I thought it was excellent, and it was because of John. Absolute high marks for the work he did, in my view.
Now, back to the political reporting. One of the captured documents was a long report that was done in the late 70s on the power structure of Iran. It was like a 150-page report, 200-page report, I think, on Iranian power structure, the various influentials of the Shah's government, so forth, the royal family, the military people. Were there similar studies done during your period of the power structure, how it works?
Certainly we reported on shifts in the power structure and their implications to the best of our understanding. But nothing like 200 pages.
Okay.
I mean, of course, there are. The Shah's policies, views, intentions are perhaps best, or any government, are best, or one key way to interpret it is the assignment of persons to key positions. So that if you put Jeane Kirkpatrick as Secretary of State, or Senator Garn in as head of the NSC or something, this has meaning. This has implications to it. So yes, we followed it quite closely and attempted to interpret that.
Now, when you left Iran in '71, did you do more work on Iran?
Yes.
As such, back at Langley?
Mm-hmm.
So you worked in the analyst division?
No.
Okay. So this is the operations directorate, I guess? I'm not sure. Yeah, what the exact terminology is. I guess you worked fairly closely with only the people in the analyst.
Absolutely.
The analyst section.
Some of them I'd known for many years.
Now, and how long did you work on Iran?
For several years.
2 or 3 more years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, you were talking a minute ago about Ernie Oney, who was the main Iran people, the intelligence side of CIA. Can you talk about him a bit?
Ernie was probably the most knowledgeable person in the U.S. government on Iran. He'd followed it for many, many years. He was a very positive, optimistic, interested person that had a very keen mind. You commented that some had viewed him as focused down in the noise, too much involved in the detail, less in the overall overarching policy of things. But you do have to remember that the agency's role is not a policy role, and that the agency's responsibility was to provide data, intelligence, out of which policymakers at, for example, INS, at the ambassadorial level, at the NSC level, would then, this was grist for their analytic mill. Yes, the case could be made that the CIA should do implications, and in their national intelligence estimates, indeed, they do just that.
Let me get on the tape.